The story of a common soldier of Army life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 by Leander Stillwell is a vivid first-hand account of an ordinary Union soldier's journey from enlistment to the harsh realities of battle and camp life. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. These are Stillwell's words. Let's begin. When I returned to Little Rock from my absence on furlough, the regiment was found installed in cozy, comfortable quarters of pine log cabins. There were extensive pine forests near Little Rock. The boys were furnished teams and axes to facilitate the work, and cut and shaped the logs for the cabin walls, and roofed them with lumber, boards, or shingles, which they procured in various ways. The walls were chinked and daubed with mud, and each cabin was provided with an ample, old-fashioned fireplace, with a rock or stick chimney. As wood was close at hand, and in abundance, there was no difficulty whatever in keeping the cabins warm. But I will remark here that, of all the mean wood to burn, a green pine log is about the worst. It is fully as bad as green elm or sycamore. But there was no lack of dry wood to mix with the green, and the green logs had this virtue: after the fire had once taken hold of them, they would last a whole night. The winter of 1863 to 1864 was remarkably cold and, to this day, is remembered by the old soldiers as the cold winter. On the last day of 1863, a heavy fall of snow occurred at Little Rock, and the first day of the new year, and several days thereafter, were bitterly cold. But the weather did not cause the troops in our immediate locality any special suffering, so far as I know or ever heard. All of us not on picket were just as comfortable as heart could wish in our tight, well-warmed cabins, and those on guard duty were permitted to build rousing fires and so got along fairly well. Big fires on the picket line would not have been allowed if any enemy had been in our vicinity, but there were none, hence, it was only common sense to let the pickets have fires and keep as comfortable as circumstances would permit. It was probably on account of the severe weather that active military operations in our locality were that winter practically suspended. There were a few cavalry affairs at outlying posts, but none of any material importance. The most painful sight that I saw during the war was here at Little Rock this winter. It was the execution, by hanging, on January 8, 1864, of a Confederate spy by the name of David O. Dodds. He was a mere boy, seemingly not more than 19 or 20 years old. There was no question as to his guilt. When arrested, there was found on his person a memorandum book containing information, written in telegraphic characters, in regard to all troops, batteries, and other military matters at Little Rock. He was tried by a court-martial and sentenced to the mode of death always inflicted on a spy, namely, by hanging. I suppose that the military authorities desired to render his death as impressive as possible, in order to deter others from engaging in a business so fraught with danger to our armies. Therefore, on the day fixed for carrying out the sentence of the court, all our troops in Little Rock turned out under arms and marched to the place of execution. It was in a large field near the town. A gallows had been erected in the center of this open space, and the troops formed around it in the form of an extensive hollow square and stood at parade rest. The spy rode through the lines to the gallows in an open ambulance, sitting on his coffin. I happened to be not far from the point where he passed through and saw him plainly. For one so young, he displayed remarkable coolness and courage when in the immediate presence of death. The manner of his execution was wretchedly bungled in some way, and the whole thing was, to me, indescribably repulsive. In the crisis of the affair, there was a sudden clang of military arms and accoutrements in the line not far from me, and, looking in that direction, I saw that a soldier in the front rank had fainted and fallen headlong to the ground. I did not faint, but the spectacle, for the time being, well-nigh made me sick. It is true that, from time immemorial, the punishment of a convicted spy has been death by hanging. The safety of whole armies, even the fate of a nation, may perhaps depend on the prompt and summary extinction of the life of a spy. As long as he is alive, he may possibly escape, or, even if closely guarded, may succeed in imparting his dangerous intelligence to others who will transmit it in his stead. Hence, no mercy can be shown. But in spite of all that, this event impressed me as somehow being unspeakably cruel and cold-blooded. On one side were thousands of men with weapons in their hands, coolly looking on the other was one lone, unfortunate boy. My conscience has never troubled me for anything I may have done on the firing line, in time of battle. There were the other fellows in plain sight, shooting, and doing all in their power to kill us. It was my duty to shoot at them, aim low, and kill some of them, if possible, and I did the best I could, and have no remorse whatever. But whenever my memory recalls the choking to death of that boy, for that is what was done, I feel bad and do not like to write or think about it. But, for fear of being misunderstood, it will be repeated that the fate of a spy, when caught, is death. It is a military necessity. The other side hanged our spies with relentless severity and were justified in so doing by laws and usages of war. Even the great and good Washington approved of the hanging of the British spy, Major Andre, and refused to commute the manner of his execution to being shot, although Andre made a personal appeal to him to grant him that favor, in order that he might die the death of a soldier. The point with me is simply this: I do not want personally to have anything to do, in any capacity, with hanging a man, and do not desire even to be in eyesight of such a gruesome thing, and voluntarily never have. However, it fell to my lot to be an involuntary witness of 2 more military executions while in the service. I will speak of them now and then be through with this disagreeable subject. On March 18, 1864, 2 guerrillas were hanged in the yard of the penitentiary at Little Rock, by virtue of the sentence of a court-martial, and my regiment acted as guard at the execution. We marched into the penitentiary enclosure and formed around the scaffold in a hollow square. As soon as this had been done, a door on the ground floor of the penitentiary was swung open, and the 2 condemned men marched out, pinioned side by side, and surrounded by a small guard. The culprits were apparently somewhere between 40 and 50 years of age. They ascended the scaffold, were placed with their feet on the trap, the nooses were adjusted, the trap was sprung, and it was all over. The crimes of which these men had been convicted were peculiarly atrocious. They were not members of any organized body of the Confederate Army but guerrillas, pure and simple. It was conclusively established on their trial that they, with some associates, had, in cold blood, murdered by hanging several men of that vicinity, private citizens of the state of Arkansas, for no other cause or reason than the fact that the victims were Union men. In some cases, the murdered men had been torn from their beds at night and hanged in their own dooryards, in the presence of their well-nigh distracted wives and children. There can be no question that these 2 unprincipled assassins richly merited their fate, and hence, it was impossible to entertain for them any feeling of sympathy. Nevertheless, I stand by my original proposition, that to see any man strung up like a dog, and hanged in cold blood, is a nauseating and debasing spectacle. In January 1864, while we were at Little Rock, the veteranizing project, as it was called, was submitted to the men. That is to say, we were asked to enlist for 3 years more, or enduring the war. Sundry inducements for this were held out to the men, but the one which, at the time, had the most weight was the promise of a 30-day furlough for each man who re-enlisted. The men, in general, responded favorably to the proposition, and enough of the 61st re-enlisted to enable the regiment to retain its organization to the end of the war. On the evening of February 1st, with several others of Company D, I walked down to the adjutant's tent and went in for 3 years more. I think that no better account of this re-enlistment business can now be given by me than by here inserting a letter I wrote on December 22, 1894, as a slight tribute to the memory of our acting regimental commander in February 1864, Major Daniel Grass. He was later promoted to lieutenant colonel and, after the war, came to Kansas, where, for many years, he was a prominent lawyer and politician. On the evening of December 18, 1894, while he was crossing a railroad track in the town where he lived, Coffeyville, Kansas, he was struck by a railroad engine and sustained injuries from which he died on December 21, at the age of a little over 70 years. A few days thereafter, the members of the bar of the county held a memorial meeting in his honor, which I was invited to attend. I was then judge of the Kansas 7th Judicial District, and my judicial duties at the time were such that I could not go and hence was compelled to content myself by writing a letter, which was later published in the local papers of the county, and which reads as follows. Erie, Kansas. December 22, 1894. Honorable J. D. McHugh. Independence, Kansas. My dear Judge, I received this evening yours of the 20th, informing me of the death of my old comrade and regimental commander during the war for the Union, Colonel Dan Grass. I was deeply moved by this sad intelligence and regret that I did not learn of his death in time to attend his funeral. I wish I could be present at the memorial meeting of the bar next Monday that you mention, but I have other engagements for that day that cannot be deferred. It affords me, however, a mournful pleasure to comply with your request, suggesting that I write a few words in the nature of a tribute to our departed friend and comrade, to be read at this meeting of the bar. But I am fearful that I shall perform this duty very unsatisfactorily. There are so many kind and good things that I would like to say about him that throng my memory at this moment that I hardly know where to begin. I served in the same regiment with Colonel Grass from January 7, 1862, to December 15, 1864. On the last named day, he was taken prisoner by the rebels in an engagement near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He was subsequently exchanged, but by that time, the war was drawing to a close, and he did not rejoin us again in the field. In May 1865, he was mustered out of the service. During his term of service with us, nearly 3 years, I became very well acquainted with him and learned to admire and love him as a man and a soldier. He was temperate in his habits, courteous and kind to the common soldiers, and as brave a man in action as I ever saw. He was, moreover, imbued with the most fervid and intense patriotism. The war, with him, was one to preserve the Republic from destruction, and his creed was that the government should draft, if necessary, every available man in the North and spend every dollar of the wealth of the country, sooner than suffer the rebellion to succeed and the nation to be destroyed. I think the most eloquent speech I ever heard in my life was one delivered by Colonel Grass to his regiment at Little Rock, Arkansas, in February 1864. The plan was then in progress to induce the veteran troops in the field to re-enlist for 3 years more. We boys called it veteranizing. For various reasons, it did not take well in our regiment. Nearly all of us had been at the front without a glimpse of our homes and friends for over 2 years. We had undergone a fair share of severe fighting and toilsome marching and the other hardships of a soldier's life, and we believed we were entitled to a little rest when our present term should expire. Hence, re-enlisting progressed slowly, and it looked as if, so far as the 61st Illinois was concerned, the undertaking was going to be a failure. While matters were in this shape, one day Colonel Grass caused the word to be circulated throughout the regiment that he would make us a speech that evening at dress parade on the subject of veteranizing. At the appointed time, we assembled on the parade ground with fuller ranks than usual, everybody being anxious to hear what old Dan, as the boys called him, would say. After the customary movements of the parade had been performed, the colonel commanded, "Parade, rest," and, without further ceremony, commenced his talk. Of course, I cannot pretend, after this lapse of time, to recall all that he said. I remember best his manner and some principal statements, and the effect they produced on us. He began talking to us like a father would talk to a lot of dissatisfied sons. He told us that he knew we wanted to go home, that we were tired of war and its hardships, that we wanted to see our fathers and mothers, and the girls we left behind, that he sympathized with us and appreciated our feelings. "But, boys," said he, "this great nation is your father and has a greater claim on you than anybody else in the world. This great father of yours is fighting for his life, and the question for you to determine now is whether you are going to stay and help the old man out, or whether you are going to sneak home and sit down by the chimney corner in ease and comfort while your comrades, by thousands and hundreds of thousands, are marching, struggling, fighting, and dying on battlefields and in prison pens to put down this wicked rebellion and save the old Union. Stand by the old flag, boys. Let us stay and see this thing out. We're going to whip 'em in the end, just as sure as God Almighty is looking down on us right now, and then we'll all go home together, happy and triumphant. And take my word for it, in after years, it will be the proudest memory of your lives to be able to say, I stayed with the old regiment and the old flag until the last gun cracked, and the war was over, and the stars and stripes were floating in triumph over every foot of the land." I can see him in my mind's eye as plain as if it were yesterday. He stood firm and erect on his feet in the position of a soldier and gestured very little, but his strong, sturdy frame fairly quivered with the intensity of his feelings, and we listened in the most profound silence. It was a raw, cold evening, and the sun, angry and red, was sinking behind the pine forests that skirted the ridges west of our camp when the colonel concluded his address. It did not, I think, exceed more than 10 minutes. The parade was dismissed, and the companies marched back to their quarters. As I put my musket on its rack and unbuckled my cartridge box, I said to one of my comrades, "I believe the old colonel is right. I am going right now down to the adjutant's tent and re-enlist," and go I did, but not alone. Down to the adjutant's tent that evening streamed the boys by the score and signed the rolls, and the fruit of that timely and patriotic talk that Dan Grass made to us boys was that the great majority of the men re-enlisted, and the regiment retained its organization and remained in the field until the end of the war. But my letter is assuming rather lengthy proportions, and I must hasten to a close. I have related just one incident in the life of Colonel Grass that illustrates his spirit of patriotism and love of country. I could speak of many more, but the occasion demands brevity. Of his career since the close of the war, in civil life here in Kansas, there are others better qualified to speak than I am. I will only say that my personal relations with him since he came to this state, dating away back in the early 70s, have continued to be, during all these years, what they were in the trying and perilous days of the war, of the most friendly and fraternal character. To me, at least, he was always Colonel Dan Grass, my regimental commander, while he, as I am happy to believe, always looked upon and remembered me simply as Lee Stillwell, the little sergeant of Company D. I remain, very sincerely, your friend, L. Stillwell. In the spring of 1864, it was determined by the military authorities to undertake some offensive operations in what was styled the Red River Country, the objective point being Shreveport, Louisiana. General N.P. Banks was to move with an army from New Orleans, and General Steele, in command of the Department of Arkansas, was to cooperate with a force from Little Rock. And here, my regiment sustained what I regarded, and still regard, as a piece of bad luck. It was not included in this moving column but was assigned to the duty of serving as provost guard of the city of Little Rock during the absence of the main army. To be left there in that capacity, while the bulk of the troops in that department would be marching and fighting, was, from my standpoint, a most mortifying circumstance. But the duty that devolved on us had to be done by somebody, and soldiers can only obey orders. Our officers said at the time that only efficient and well-disciplined troops were entrusted with the position of provost guards of a city the size of Little Rock, and hence that our being so designated was a compliment to the regiment. That sounded plausible, and it may have been true, probably was, but I did not like the job a bit. It may, however, have all been for the best, as this Red River expedition, especially the part undertaken by General Banks, was a disastrous failure. General Steele left Little Rock about March 23 with a force, of all arms, of about 12,000 men, but got no further than Camden, Arkansas. General Banks was defeated by the Confederates at the Battle of Sabine Crossroads, in Louisiana, on April 8, and was forced to retreat. The enemy then was at liberty to concentrate on General Steele, and so he likewise was under the necessity of retreating and scuttling back to Little Rock just as rapidly as possible. But on this retreat, he and his men did some good, hard fighting and stood off the Confederates effectively. About the first intimation we in Little Rock had that our fellows were coming back was when nearly every soldier in the city that was able to wield a mattock or a spade was detailed for fatigue duty and set to work throwing up breastworks, and kept at it, both day and night. I happened to see General Steele when he rode into town on May 2, at the head of his troops, and he looked tough. He had on a battered felt hat, with a drooping brim, an oilcloth slicker, much the worse for wear, the ends of his pantaloons were stuck in his boots, and he was just splashed and splattered with mud from head to foot. But he sat firm and erect in his saddle, he was a magnificent horseman, and his eyes were flashing as if he had plenty of fight left in him yet. And the rank and file of our retreating army was just the hardest-looking outfit of Federal soldiers that I saw during the war, at any time. Most of them looked as if they had been rolled in the mud, numbers of them were barefoot, and I also saw several with the legs of their trousers all gone, high up, socking through the mud like big blue cranes. In view of the feverish haste with which Little Rock had been put in a state for defensive operations, and considering also all the reports in circulation, we fully expected that Price's whole army would make an attack on us almost any day. But the Confederates had been so roughly handled in the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, April 30, on the Saline River, that none of their infantry came east of that river, nor any of their cavalry except a small body, which soon retired. The whole Confederate army, about May 1, fell back to Camden, and soon all was again quiet along the Arkansas. I will now go back about 2 weeks in order to give an account of a little expedition our regiment took part in when General Steele's army was at Camden. Late on the evening of April 19, we fell in, marched to the railroad depot, climbed on the cars, and were taken that night to Devall's Bluff. The next morning, we embarked on the steamboat James Raymond and started up White River. The other troops that took part in the movement were the 3rd Minnesota Infantry and a detachment of the 8th Missouri Cavalry. We arrived at the town of Augusta, about 80 miles by water from Devall's Bluff, on the morning of the 21st. It was a little, old, dilapidated river town, largely in a deserted condition, situated on low-bottom land, on the east bank of White River. On arriving, we at once debarked from the boat, and all our little force marched out a mile or so east of the town, where we halted and formed in line of battle at the edge of the woods, with a large open field in our front, on the other side of which were tall, dense woods. As there were no signs or indications of any enemy in the town, and everything around was so quiet and sleepy, I could not understand what these ominous preparations meant. Happening to notice the old chaplain a short distance in the rear of our company, I slipped out of ranks and walked back to him for the purpose of getting a pointer, if possible. He was by himself, and as I approached him, he seemed to be looking rather serious. He probably saw inquiry in my eyes, and without waiting for a question, made a gesture with his hands towards the woods in our front, and said, "O son of Jeremiah! Here is where we shall give battle to those who trouble Israel." "What? What is that you say?" said I, in much astonishment. "It is even so," he continued, "the Philistines are abroad in the land, having among them, as they assert, many valiant men who can sling stones at a hair's breadth and not miss. They await us, even now, in the forest beyond. But, son of Jeremiah," said he, "if the uncircumcised heathen should assail the Lord's anointed, be strong, and quit yourself like a man." "All right, chaplain," I responded, "I have 40 rounds in the box, and 40 on the person, and will give them the best I have in the shop. But, say, take care of my watch, will you? And, should anything happen, please send it to the folks at home." Handing him my little old silver timepiece, I resumed my place in the ranks. After what seemed to me a most tiresome wait, we finally advanced, preceded by a line of skirmishers. I kept my eyes fixed on the woods in our front, expecting every minute to see burst therefrom puffs of white smoke, followed by the whiz of bullets and the crash of musketry, but nothing of the kind happened. Our skirmishers entered the forest and disappeared, and still, everything remained quiet. The main line followed, and after gaining the woods, we discovered plenty of evidence that they had quite recently been occupied by a body of cavalry. The ground was cut up by horses' tracks, and little piles of corn in the ear, only partly eaten, were scattered around. We advanced through the woods and swamps for some miles and scouted around considerably but found no enemy, except a few stragglers that were picked up by our cavalry. We left Augusta on the 24th, on our steamboat, and arrived at Little Rock on the same day. I met the chaplain on the boat while on our return and remarked to him, "Those mighty men who could kill a jaybird with a slingshot a quarter of a mile off did not stay to see the show." "No," he answered, "when the sons of Belial beheld our warlike preparation, their hearts melted, and became as water. They got every man upon his ass, and speedily fled, even beyond the brook which is called Cache." He then went on to tell me that on our arrival at Augusta, there was a body of Confederate cavalry near there, supposed to be about 1,000 strong, under the command of a General McCrae, that they were bivouacked in the woods in front of the line of battle we formed, and that on our approach, they had scattered and fled. The enemy's force really exceeded ours, but as a general proposition, their cavalry was reluctant to attack our infantry in a broken country unless they could accomplish something in the nature of a surprise or otherwise have a decided advantage at the start. On May 16, we shifted our camp to Huntersville, on the left bank of the Arkansas River, and near our first location. We thus abandoned our log cabins and never occupied them again. They were now getting too close and warm for comfort, anyhow. But they had been mighty good friends to us in the bitterly cold winter of 1863 to 1864, and during that time, we spent many a cozy, happy day and night therein. On May 19, we again received marching orders, and the regiment left camp that night on the cars and went to Hicks Station, 28 miles from Little Rock. We remained here, bivouacking in the woods, until the 22nd, when, at 3 o'clock in the morning of that day, we took up the line of march, moving in a northerly direction. The troops that composed our force consisted of the 61st, 54th, and 106th Illinois, and 12th Michigan Infantry Regiments, a battery of artillery, and some detachments of cavalry, with Brigadier General J.R. West in command. We arrived at the town of Austin, 18 miles from Hicks Station, about 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 22nd. It was a little country village, situated on a rocky, somewhat elevated ridge. As I understand, it is now a station on the Iron Mountain Railroad, which has been built since the war. I reckon if, in May 1864, anyone had predicted that someday a railroad would be built and in operation through that insignificant settlement among the rocks and trees, he would have been looked on as hardly a safe person to be allowed to run at large. Company D started on the march with only one commissioned officer, 2nd Lieutenant Wallace. I have forgotten the cause of the absence of Captain Keeley and Lieutenant Warren, but there was doubtless some good reason. On the first day's march, the weather was hot, and the route was through a very rough and broken country. Wallace was overcome by heat and had to fall out and wait for an ambulance. In consequence, it so happened that when we reached Austin, there was no commissioned officer with us, and I, as first sergeant, was in command of the company. And that gave rise to an incident which, at the time, swelled me up immensely. On arriving at the town, the regiment halted on some open ground in the outskirts, fell into line, dressed on the colors, and stood at ordered arms. Thereupon, the adjutant commanded, commanding officers of companies, to the front and center, march. I was completely taken by surprise by this command and, for a second or two, stood dazed and uncertain. But 2 or 3 of the boys spoke up at once and said, "You're our commanding officer, Stillwell, go." The situation by this time had also dawned on me, so I promptly obeyed the command. But I must have been a strange-looking commanding officer. I was barefooted, breeches rolled up nearly to the knees, feet and ankles scratched and tanned, and my face covered with sweat and dirt. The closest scrutiny would have failed to detect in me a single feature of the supposed pomp and circumstance of an alleged military hero. But I stalked down the line, barefoot and all, with my musket at his shoulder arms, and looking fully as proud, I imagine, as Henry of Navarre ever did at the Battle of Ivry, with a snow-white plume upon his gallant crest. By the proper and usual commands, the commanding officers of companies were brought up and halted within a few paces of Colonel Orr, who thereupon addressed them as follows. "Gentlemen, have your men stack arms where they now are, and at once prepare their dinner. They can disperse to get wood and water, but caution them strictly not to wander far from the gun stacks. We may possibly pass the night here, but we may be called on, at any moment, to fall in and resume the march. That's all, gentlemen." While the colonel was giving these instructions, I thought a sort of unusual twinkle sparkled in his eyes as they rested on me. But, for my part, I was never more serious in my life. Returning to the company, I gave the order to stack arms, which being done, the boys crowded around me, plying me with questions. What did the colonel say? "What's up, Stillwell?" I assumed a prodigiously fierce and authoritative look and said, "Say, do you fellows suppose that we, commanding officers of companies, are going to give away to a lot of lousy privates a confidential communication from the colonel? If you are guilty of any more such impertinent conduct, I'll have every mother's son of you bucked and gagged." The boys all laughed, and after a little more fun of that kind, I repeated to them literally every word the colonel said, and then we all set about getting dinner. About this time, Lieutenant Wallace rode up in an ambulance, and my reign was over. We resumed the march at 3 o'clock in the morning of the next day, May 23rd, marched 18 miles, and bivouacked that night at Peach Orchard Gap. This was no town, simply a natural feature of the country. Left here the next morning, May 24th, at daylight, marched 18 miles, and bivouacked on a stream called Little Cadron. Left at daylight the next morning, May 25th, marched 18 miles, and went into camp near the town of Springfield. By this time, the intelligence had filtered down to the common soldiers as to the object of this expedition. It was to intercept and give battle to a force of Confederate cavalry, under General J.O. Shelby, operating somewhere in this region and supposed to have threatening designs on the Little Rock and Devall's Bluff Railroad. But so far as encountering the Confederates was concerned, the movement was an entire failure. My experience during the war warrants the assertion, I think, that it is no use to send infantry after cavalry. It is very much like a man on foot trying to run down a jackrabbit. It may be that infantry can sometimes head off cavalry and thereby frustrate an intended movement, but men on horses cannot be maneuvered into fighting men on foot unless the horsemen are willing to engage. Otherwise, they will just keep out of the way. We remained at Springfield until May 28th. It was a little place, and its population when the war began was probably not more than 150 or 200. It was the county seat of Conway County, but there was no official business being transacted there now. About all the people had left, except a few old men and some women and small children. The houses were nearly all log cabins. Even the county jail was a log structure of a very simple and unimposing type. It has always been my opinion that this little place was the most interesting and romantic-looking spot, with one possible exception I may speak of later, that I saw in the South during all my Army service. The town was situated on rather high ground and in the heart of the primitive forest. Grand native trees were growing in the dooryards, and even in the middle of the main street, and all around everywhere. And we were there at a season of the year when nature was at its best, and all the scenery was most attractive and charming. I sometimes would sit down at the foot of some big tree in the center of the little village and ponder on what surely must have been the happy, contented condition of its people before the war came along and spoiled all. Judging from the looks of the houses, the occupants doubtless had been poor people and practically all on the same financial footing, so there was no occasion for envy. And there was no railroad, nor telegraph line, nor daily papers to keep them nervous and excited or cause them to worry. And they were far away from the busy haunts of congregated men. Their best companions, innocence and health. And their best riches, ignorance of wealth. Their trading point was Lewisburg, about 15 miles southwest on the Arkansas River, and when that stream was at a proper stage, small steamboats would ply up and down and bring to Lewisburg groceries and dry goods and such other things as the country did not produce, which would then be wagoned out to Springfield and into the country generally. I have never been at the little town since the occasion now mentioned, so personally, I know nothing of its present appearance and condition. However, as a matter of general information, it may be said that after the war, a railroad was built running up the Arkansas River Valley, through the south part of the county. This road left Springfield out, so in course of time, it lost the county seat, which went to a railroad town. And this road also missed Lewisburg, which has now disappeared from the map entirely. When in camp at Springfield, many of the boys, in accordance with their usual habits, of their own motion, at once went scouting around over the adjacent country, after pigs, or chickens, or anything else that would serve to vary army fare. While so engaged, 2 or 3 of our fellows discovered a little old whiskey still. It was about 2 miles from Springfield, situated in a deep, timbered hollow, near a big spring. It was fully equipped for active operation, with a supply of mash on hand, and all other essentials for turning out whiskey. Some of the 10th Illinois Cavalry found it first and scared away the proprietor, then took charge of the still and proceeded to carry on the business on their own account. The boys of the 61st, who stumbled on the place, were too few to cope with the cavalrymen. Thereupon, they hastened back to camp and informed some trusty comrades of the delectable discovery. Forthwith, they organized a strong party as an alleged provost guard, and, all armed, and under the command of a daring, reckless duty sergeant, hastened to the still. On arriving there, in their capacity as provost guards, they summarily arrested the cavalrymen, with loud threats of condign punishment. But after scaring them sufficiently, and on their solemn promise to at once return to camp and be good in the future, they released them and allowed them to depart. Then our bunch stacked arms and started in to make whiskey. Some of the number had served in the business before and knew all about it, so that little still there in the hollow was then in their work to its utmost capacity, day and night, and doubtless as it never had been before. Knowledge of this enterprise spread like wildfire among the enlisted men, and oh, how the whiskey went down at Springfield. Away along, some hours after midnight, I would hear some of the boys coming in from the still, letting out keen, piercing whoops that could be heard nearly a mile. Like the festive tam o' shanter, with apologies to Burns. The swats say reamed in every noddle. They cared na rebs nor guards a bottle. I took just one little taste of the stuff from Sam Ralston's canteen. It was limpid and colorless as water, and fairly burned like fire as it went down my throat. That satisfied my curiosity, and after that, many similar offers were declined with thanks. Whether the officers at the time knew of this business or not, I do not know. If they did, they just winked the other eye and said nothing, for the boys ran the still, without restriction or interruption, until we left Springfield. Telling of the foregoing episode causes many other incidents to come flocking to my memory that came under my notice during my Army career, and in which whiskey figured more or less. The insatiable, inordinate appetite of some of the men for intoxicating liquor of any kind was something remarkable, and the ingenious schemes they would devise to get it were worthy of admiration, had they been exerted in a better cause. And they were not a bit fastidious about the kind of liquor, it was the effect that was desired. One afternoon, a day or two after we arrived at Helena, Arkansas, a sudden yell, a sort of key-yip, was heard issuing from one of the company tents, soon followed by others of the same tone. I had heard that peculiar yelp before and knew what it meant. Presently, I sauntered down to the tent from whence the sounds issued and walked in. Several of the boys were seated around, in an exalted state of vociferous hilarity, and a flat, pint bottle, with the figure of a green leaf on one side and labeled bay rum on the other, was promptly handed to me with the invitation to drink hearty. I did taste it. It was oily, greasy, and unpleasant, but there was no doubt that it was intoxicating. It was nothing but bay rum, the same stuff that, in those days, barbers were wont to use in their line of business. It finally came to light that the sutler of some regiment at Helena had induced the post-quartermaster at Cairo to believe that the troops stood in urgent need of bay rum for the purpose of anointing their hair, and thereupon, he obtained permission to include several boxes of the stuff in his sutler's supplies. When he got it to Helena, he proceeded to sell it at $1 a bottle, and his stock was exhausted in a few hours. What may have been done to this sutler, I do not know, but that was the last and only time that I know of bay rum being sold to the soldiers as a toilet article or otherwise. Of course, all sutlers and civilians were prohibited, under severe penalties, from selling intoxicating liquor to the enlisted men, but the profits were so large that the temptation was great to occasionally transgress in some fashion. But, as a general rule, I think that the orders were scrupulously obeyed. The risk was too great to do otherwise. I remember a little personal experience of my own, when once I tried to buy a drink of whiskey. It is not a long story, so it will be told. It occurred at Deval's Bluff, in October 1863, when our little furlough party was there, waiting for the arrival of a boat from below on which to resume our homeward journey. One night in particular was quite cold. We slept in our blankets on the ground near the bank of the river, built good fires, and tried to keep as comfortable as possible. But the morning after this cold night, I got up feeling wretched, both mentally and physically. I was weak from previous illness, my rheumatic pains were worse, and my condition, in general, was such as caused me to fear that I was liable to break down and not be able to go home. It occurred to me that a drink of whiskey might brace me up some, so I started out to obtain one, if possible. There was a sort of wharf boat at the landing, moored to the bank, a stationary, permanent affair, with a saloon appurtenant. I went on the boat, walked up to the bar, and, exhibiting a greenback to the barkeeper, asked him if he would sell me a drink of whiskey. "Can't do it," he answered, "the orders are strict against selling whiskey to soldiers." I began moving away, and at that instant, a big, greasy, colored deckhand, or laborer of some sort, black as the ace of spades, crowded by me, brushing against me in the narrow passage on his way to the bar. "Boss," he called to the keeper, "want a dram?" A bottle and a glass were pushed towards him. He filled the glass to the brim, and drank the contents at a gulp. Then he smacked his big lips, rolled his eyes around, and with a deep breath exclaimed, "Ah! Dat whiskey feels de poful good dis cole mornin'." I looked at the darky in bitterness of heart and could not help thinking that it was all fired mean when a poor little sick soldier was not allowed to buy a drink of whiskey, while a great big buck Negro roustabout had it handed out to him with cheerfulness and alacrity. But the orders forbidding the sale of intoxicating liquors to soldiers were all right and an imperative military necessity. If the men had been allowed unlimited access to whiskey and the like, that would, in my opinion, simply have been ruinous to the good order, discipline, and efficiency of the army. That statement is based on events I saw myself while in the service, and which occurred when, in spite of the orders, the men managed to obtain liquor without let or hindrance. The scenes that would then ensue are too unpleasant to talk about, so they will be passed over in silence. It is only fair, however, to say that the same men who, when furiously drunk, were a disgrace to themselves and the organization to which they belonged, were, as a general rule, faithful and brave soldiers when sober. At 4 o'clock on the morning of the 28th we broke camp at Springfield, and started back to Little Rock, marching in a southeasterly direction. We marched all that day, the 29th, 30th, and 31st, and arrived at our old camp at Huntersville at 9 o'clock in the evening of the last mentioned day. According to the official report, the entire distance marched on the expedition, going and coming, was 190 miles, and we didn't see an armed Confederate on the whole trip. Our return route was through the wilderness, most of it primeval forest, and we didn't pass through a single town. But now there is a railroad that runs practically over all the course we followed during the last 3 days we were on this march. I haven't been in that region since we passed through there in May, 1864, but at that time it certainly was a very wild, rough, and broken country. We here had our first experience with scorpions and tarantulas, and soon learned that it was prudent, when bivouacking on the ground, to carefully turn over all loose rocks and logs in order to find and get rid of those ugly customers. The scorpions were about 4 or 5 inches long, the forepart of the body something like a crawfish, with a sharp stinger on the end of the tail. When excited or disturbed, they would curl their tails over their backs, and get over the ground quite rapidly. The tarantulas were just big hairy spiders, of a blackish-gray color, about as big as toads, and mighty ugly-looking things. The sting of the tarantula, and the bite of a spider, were very painful, but when that happened to any of us, which was seldom, our remedy was to apply a big, fresh quid of tobacco to the wound, which would promptly neutralize the poison. That concludes the 13th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.